Welcome to Strictly Facts, a guide to Caribbean history and culture, hosted by me, Alexandria Miller. Strictly Facts teaches the history, politics, and activism of the Caribbean and connects these themes to contemporary music and popular culture. Welcome, people, and welcome back to another episode of Strictly Facts, a guide to Caribbean history and culture. I am your host, Alexandria, and I am so happy to welcome our first guest, my girl, Melanie White. But, before we really dive into things, and I'll let Melanie introduce herself in a minute, have you ever seen those memes online where, you're talking about Guyana, and then they're like, Guyana says chicken curry and not curry chicken, but Guyana's in South America, so technically how are they a part of the Caribbean? There's a lot of questions when it comes to what exactly is Caribbean geography. So that's what Melanie and I are going to be speaking about today. So Melanie, welcome to the show. Please let everybody know who you are, what you do, and obviously, the main reason why we're here today, what Caribbean country that you represent.
Thanks so much, Alexandria. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for thinking of me and inviting me onto your podcast. This is a topic that I'm constantly thinking about and that resonates a lot with my work. I am actually a Ph.D. candidate in Africana Studies at Brown University. So I'm finishing up my last 2 years, currently working on my dissertation. And I'm originally from Miami, Florida, where I also currently live. And my mom is actually from the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua. She comes from a small island off the coast called Corn Island. And my dad is actually from Cuba. He's from Havana.
Very cool. Yes. The Caribbean diaspora, obviously, we're both doctoral students studying the Caribbean. But more importantly, what do we label as the confines and regional borders, so-called, of the Caribbean? So yeah, today, this episode is, the first of what I'm conceiving as a two-part episode. So this one is definitely about the region of the Caribbean as far as defined by the Caribbean Sea. And then we'll be talking about in the following episode about the diaspora. So I think just in general, there are a lot of misconceptions about what we define as the Caribbean. Do people think of it as islands? Do people think of it as what are the, maybe independent countries? Because there are still places that are also territories. So I guess we can just start off with, some quote unquote like geographic facts and stuff. So, the Caribbean on a whole is made up of hundreds of islands and countries, cays, nations. It's a mix of everything that are, for the most part, defined by its proximity to the Caribbean Sea. And so, most of those hundreds of islands are inhabited, but then there are kind of the greater Antilles, which include independent nations like Cuba, Jamaica, Haiti, and DR, which, Haiti and DR are part of Hispaniola. So another key fact here when we're thinking of Caribbean geography. And then you have the Lesser Antilles, which are, that kind of arc of states, nations, islands that are north of South America. So some are independent, some are still territories. And then, when you think of the Lesser Antilles, it can also be further broken down into the Leeward Islands, which includes like the U.S. and British Virgin Islands, Guadeloupe, St. Kitts and Nevis. And then you have the Windward Islands, which are St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Dominica. So, there's a kind of array of a lot of things, including also the Leeward Antilles, which is Aruba, Bonaire, Curacao. And then lastly, you can't forget the weird arc that is Turks and Caicos and the Bahamas, which are to the east of Florida. So there's a bunch of things when it comes to kind of defining what is the Caribbean. But then, if you think of something like CARICOM, which for those who aren't familiar, CARICOM is, I guess you can maybe, make the analogy to like the EU or what we, used to think of as the EU. But CARICOM is also the acronym for Caribbean Community, which is the regional community or union amongst Caribbean nations, island states. And so, members of CARICOM are, Cuba, Jamaica, etc. But then you also have states like Belize and Guyana and Suriname that are also part of the Caribbean community. So it's like, how does that, even come into play? And so I guess with that, Melanie, we'll start with what are some of your misconceptions, or what were some of your misconceptions of the Caribbean growing up? How and where did you learn this?
Yeah, thank you so much for that overview. That was really good. I feel like growing up, I didn't receive any kind of education about what constituted the Caribbean. Also, growing up, I called it Caribbean. I don't know. There's like apparently a debate about whether it's Caribbean or Caribbean. Growing up, I called it Caribbean, but then like once I went to like university and like grad school, I've kind of like switched over to calling it Caribbean. I'm not sure how that happened. So growing up, I guess like a lot of people who were living in the diaspora, who did not grow up or weren't born in the Caribbean, for me, it was what we saw on TV, a place very tropical, lots of beaches, tourism heavy, just like kind of like pristine paradises that were like little known or little explored. These are all these images that we kind of see growing up. And also being from Miami, I kind of, was around a lot of Cubans, Puerto Ricans. There's a lot of Haitians in Miami. There's Bahamians in Miami. And Miami's like history, is very intertwined with like Caribbean people and Caribbean migration. So I kind of also had that sort of like historical context. But most of what I knew was, I guess, like based off of like what I saw on TV, and then also like my own personal family background. Growing up, I didn't exactly know what Corn Island was. I was like, why have none of my friends heard about this place? My family's Black, though. My family speaks similarly to the way that, I think Jamaicans speak. So it was kind of an introduction in that way. So I kind of had this like early introduction or idea around the fact that like migrations happened, and somehow like people who were Jamaican were like my family, or my family was like Jamaicans. So I knew that something had happened historically, but I had no kind of formal education around it. Neither did my family. It wasn't until I was in high school and I did my own kind of online research. It wasn't until then that I actually learned about the history of Caribbean Nicaragua and the coast of Caribbean Central America, and that historically there have been numerous migration patterns of people from the Caribbean, going to places like Cuba, like for example, Jamaicans in Cuba, or, Jamaican
Yeah.
migrant laborers going to Caribbean Central America in the 20th century.
Oh yes, we're definitely going to talk about that. But one thing I thought about that really struck out to me is, especially as children of the diaspora, or children of, maybe in my case, immigrants to this country, it's so, I mean, I guess it's good and bad that we are doing this research, right? Like the fact that we have to become kind of early scholars within ourselves, right? Which I think is something that really influences both my work and your work. That, like, had we not, had the privilege to reach where we are academically, had we not, kind of sought our own path in that way, this research, this history, this understanding of who we are as a Caribbean people, as first generation, etc., like this would be lost in some sense. And so I just wanted to shout out to you for doing that work as well. But yeah, so I guess then to follow up, what's your current definition of the Caribbean, and how has it been shaped by all these changes and understandings in your kind of young adult life?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I guess like through that kind of like self-directed research I did in high school about, my family's background, that's where I really began to learn about this history, and I further wanted to explore that in college. So I studied anthropology because I was like, wow, like this is a perfect opportunity to get like university funding and money. to like actually travel to the place that my family's from, because I'd never been there. Like my first time going to Corn Island was through like this undergraduate anthropology grant I got from.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So it was in college, I would say. One of the first courses I took that really just shaped the way I thought about the Caribbean was Caribbean Culture and Politics with Professor Deborah Thomas at Penn. And, you know, we spent a lot of time thinking about Haiti. And also we thought a lot about Jamaica and the tourism industry there and the kind of like the legacies of slavery and colonialism in the current day. So that was like really my first introduction, and it kind of paved the way for what I think now is my definition of the Caribbean, which is, you know, it's an expansive geographic region that's not limited just to the Caribbean Sea, of course, but extends, you know, throughout the whole US South, perhaps throughout the Caribbean coast of Central America and the Caribbean coasts of like Northern South America. So I include all of it. Like I'm of that school that's like, yeah, like why not? Like anywhere that has a Caribbean community or Caribbean coastal community that has a history of exchange or interchange with the Caribbean, like that is the Caribbean. I consider Miami to be the Caribbean. Mm-hmm. But yeah, just like I guess specifically naming my conception, I would say that it's an expansive geographic region, and it's also a historical formation that, you know, has been tainted by these violent legacies of slavery and colonialism. And it's that kind of socio-historical and political formation, to me, that takes a central place in my imagination of the region. So not so much these kind of like, you know, colonial maps and metrics and ways of thinking about place, but kind of like history and just kind of like interchange and like just all these like small histories we never learn about. Like literally like any country you point to like has this like these hidden histories, and like anyone I meet, any Caribbean place or island, like there's like lots of migration stories and just lots of really interesting histories that we don't learn about. I would say not even in academia, like they just remain hidden, unfortunately.
I agree. And so something you brought up is migration, right? Immigration, migration, etc. One thing that I think has kind of been on my mind recently is, right, like the conversation about migrating, I guess in the sort of dominant sphere is, at least in my kind of personal clique crew, whatever you want to call that, right? It's always like you're migrating to go foreign, or foreign, which is usually like a colonial body, right? Or former colonial body, etc. So, you know, in Jamaica's case, that could mean England, that could mean the US, that could mean Canada, that could mean France, you know, X number of places. We so rarely talk about migrating within the region, right? You know, there's like a lot of people that if you read their biographies, you'll find out, like, for example, Rita Marley, who obviously we all know historically, wife of Bob Marley, she was actually born in Cuba, you know, so obviously everybody knows her as Jamaican songstress, you know, wife of Bob Marley, singer in the I3, but she was born in Cuba because her family was living there at the time, and, you know, that's how she came about. Or writer Merle Collins, who everybody knows as a Grenadian author, was born in Aruba because her parents had migrated there and then, you know, moved back to Grenada later on in her childhood. So I guess if you want to talk a bit about, you know, migrational patterns within the region, and again, maybe expanding upon your own family history.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I actually didn't know until recently that Rita Marley was born in Cuba. I see that she was born in Santiago de Cuba, which makes me think like perhaps her parents were working in the sugar industry. I mean, that's probably most likely, but I couldn't find more information about like her familial, what do you call it? Like,
lineage.
Yeah, lineage, or like what they were doing in Cuba. But that's really interesting. And I think it also brings light to the fact that like even within, you know, African American history, or these kind of like key figures, Black feminist figures like Audre Lorde, for example, who we tend to think of as like, you know, US based, or, you know, Black US figures, a lot of them do have roots in the Caribbean. Audre Lorde, you know, her dad was Bayesian and her mom was Grenadian, and she does write about that, but we don't tend to like think of her in that light. So that's all very interesting to me as well. Yeah, and in my own family history, my paternal grandmother, her mother was of Haitian descent. Unfortunately,
Mm.
I don't know too much about that history. I do know there's a lot of Haitians in Cuba though. And so like my own family lineage has this like story
Yeah.
that I need to like do more uncovering for.
Mm-hmm.
And then like within my mom's side of the family, my grandmother, for example, she's from Corn Island, Nicaragua, but her dad was working in the Panama Canal Zone. So at the
Mm.
time, you know, my grandmother was born in Colon, Panama. And so there's just all these kind of like migration stories within my own family. Unfortunately, like, you know, my grandmother unfortunately passed away. So like, there's so much that I want to learn that I'll have to like do some digging around.
Yeah.
But yes, there's a lot of like labor migration, like again with on the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua, even to this day, lots of folks kind of migrate abroad for work. Like they go to the Cayman Islands, they do kind of like fishing
Mm-hmm.
over there. They work on, you know, cruise ships, on merchant ships, and not just the Cayman Islands, but also San Andres and like Providence Island, which those two islands in particular also tend to get erased from like
Mm-hmm.
Caribbean history. But yeah, within the context of Caribbean Nicaragua, there's lots of like migration for labor. And then also historically, we can't forget like in the context of slavery, like there are so many cases of like maroons and enslaved Africans like fleeing
Mm-hmm.
their context of slavery. Again, within the Mestiza, which is basically a kind of colonial term for what's present day Caribbean, Nicaragua, and Honduras. There's lots of folks who like were maroons fleeing the Mosquitia and who went to Belize, or like, you know, people from Jamaica fleeing to Central America. So that's like an
Yeah.
important history of migration as well.
Yeah. And, even to bring back up Panama again, right? I was reading in like the 1880s. So, well, Panama on a whole, people were immigrating to Panama between like the 1850s and roughly like 1914. First, for the railroad, and then later to help build the canal and, aspire to have a better life and all of that. But like, in the 1880s, it was estimated that there were like 10,000 people from the British West Indies who had migrated to Panama to, help build the canal. And so, shameless plug, you can check out our syllabus, which goes with each episode. One of the books, if you'd like to learn more about Panama, is Dying to Better Themselves by Olive Sr., where she really does an expansive look at the migration patterns of people across the West Indies who moved to Panama. Okay, so one thing you also bring up is, the impact of, these colonial legacies on what we're calling the Caribbean, right? And so depending on where we're talking about, this could mean former colonies or, even maybe for some of them present colonies today that were formerly owned by the British or the Dutch, the French, from Spain. And, even in the case of the USVI, they were at one point owned by Denmark before the land was sold. I hate to say that, but, sold to the US. And so this impacts, what we're calling the Caribbean, but also how and what we know about ourselves because of these very serious language barriers, right? For maybe somebody who speaks English but doesn't speak French, they're not so as versed in what is the maybe Haitian history, or, especially when it comes to thinking of histories by the people who live there, especially presently, right? The other problem with history, which is a whole, separate episode and separate discussion, is the fact that how many of us are writing our own stories. So that, impacts what we know on a whole nother level. But I don't know if you want to speak a bit about race and ethnicity and also language even, and how this impacts what we label as the Caribbean.
Yes, of course. No, that's a really good and pertinent question that I think comes up time and again in our thinking about the region. You know, on the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua, there's 6 ethnic groups. So that alone,
Wow. Yeah.
there's 2 Black or Afro descendant groups. They're called one is called Creoles, and then the other is called the Garifuna. And then there's the indigenous group of the Rama, the Miskito, and also the Mayangna. And then you have the Mestizo, kind of like the national majority, or the mestizos who kind of like have made their way out to the coast, and currently like make up the majority of like the demographic population on the Caribbean coast. So just like in that context alone, there's like this really great racial and ethnic diversity. And there is the question of like language barrier, there is the question of ethnic tension. All of this does come up. And I think also historically in the Caribbean, you have these kind of like struggles over how the nation gets represented nationally. I think this has been, an issue that's come up in Trinidad's history,
Yeah.
Where it's like there's the issue of like, Indo-Trinidadians like not feeling represented, or like Trinidad being kind of like seen as like this Black country. And then in Belize, Belize is also kind of seen as like the Black country of Central America. However, you have like this great ethnic diversity there as well. You have Garifuna, you have Creoles, you have Mayans, you have mestizos. So I think that this kind of like ethnic diversity is really, it's a big part of like what makes up the Caribbean and Caribbean politics. And I think that it does shape how we perceive the Caribbean. So one of the things that I'm constantly like thinking about is the way that like the Caribbean as a place gets imagined and conceived as Black within the kind of like even in like a larger, broader imaginary, within the tourist imaginary. I think the region is kind of, it's seen through the lens of Blackness, which I think is important. But sometimes, the histories of like indentured laborers, like Chinese indentured laborers, or like Indian indentured laborers, like those kinds of histories do tend to kind of be eclipsed. And I also think there's like a kind of insidious way in which when Blackness gets taken up as a kind of like regional or national symbol, that there's like some anti-Black workings there, where like lots of folks are able to kind of like appropriate elements of like Black culture, whether it's through language or just kind of like national ideas of what makes our culture, like our food, but at the same time then like still get away with like anti-Blackness. I know that's certainly the case on the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua. You have like mestizos, who basically, for anyone who doesn't know what that term means, it denotes kind of like someone who's of European and indigenous ancestry, not non-Black. So you have like mestizos claiming, to be like also from the Caribbean coast, and like, oh, my family's been here, for a few decades, and like the same food. Like we also eat, rondon, we love pati, we love just kind of like all these facets of like Black Caribbean culture. So I think a lot about that, and it's something that I think I need to explore a little more. I don't know what your thoughts are about that.
I mean, it's definitely something I think about, even to bring back. I know I talked about Guyana in the beginning. So, like, for maybe anybody who's wondering why Guyana even counts as part of the Caribbean. So, obviously, for the kind of popular language and for most of South America, they were obviously heavily, formerly Spanish colonized, for the most part. But for Guyana, that is, actually the only former British colony within South America. So when you think of the number of, what was formerly known as the British West Indies, it was obviously, Jamaica, Trinidad, a number of places. But I think it's important that we include Guyana in that, because with that, obviously unfortunate colonial history, it also comes with an impact of serious legacies, right? So whatever was the sort of, even education system, if you were a British colony, you were obviously educated a certain way under the colonial authority, different from maybe country that was owned by the French. And so I think these colonial legacies and the impact that colonialism has today is still obviously present, and then also then impacts what we know, because one of my friends, shout out to Morgan, was working in Martinique, and she was talking about how, as a teacher in Martinique, she was having issues teaching her students about, Anglophone Caribbean history because of that language divide. So these are clearly problems that, necessarily weren't ours to begin with because, we didn't ask for all of this drama, but they still obviously impact us today. And there's something that I think we seriously need to overcome to become a better unit as we are.
Just one thing I forgot to mention is just kind of like how these kind of like language divisions tie in with the geographic divisions and like how we name and define space. The whole conversation around, or it shouldn't really even be a conversation, but the issue of people like not considering Haiti to be a part of Latin America, or like what we define as Latin America, and like, oh, if you're English speaking, you're definitely not Latin American, but like you have to like be Spanish or French or Portuguese speaking, just these kind of like arbitrary markers that to me kind of pushed aside more important colonial histories. That's like a key issue. And then just in general, I think like that conversation around Haiti and whether or not it's to be included in the category of Latin America, it also just like brings up the whole, the whole conversation around kind of like Latinidad, or like Latin American anti-Blackness, and like a huge part of like how these groupings are made, or like who gets to be included within Latin America is like, it's typically like anti-Black. So which also in my current diasporic context, as a second gen Creole Nicaraguan from the coast, it brings up the issue of like self-identification. So like growing up, in Miami among kind of like indigenous descendant, but like not indigenous mestizo Latinx people and kids and stuff like that, I always, felt different. I grew up around a lot of like mestizo Nicaraguans, who are from the other side of Nicaragua, whose culture is totally different, who are not Black, who speak Spanish, purely Spanish. And I have like an English surname. So that is like interesting. That issue kind of comes up for me. And it's part of why, like, growing up, I was like unsure whether to classify myself as Latina or Latinx. Like, I never actually did. And even to this day, it's something that I think about, like whether to include myself in a category that has like excluded me, in order to kind of like make a statement about its exclusion, or like kind of just like being like, no, I don't want a part of anything that has excluded me. And I think that that's an issue also, not just for people like me in the diaspora, but like for the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua, who like over the last century has been really forced to kind of like be Hispanicized, or like kind of be integrated into like the Nicaraguan national body. Like Nicaragua is the colonial body in our context. Like even though we're like a part of Nicaragua, I mean, Nicaragua is the is the colonizer. Whether you want to call it internal colonialism or just flat out colonialism, that's just the truth of the matter, because we were like militarily annexed by Nicaragua in 1894. Historically, like we were our own semi-autonomous region, and Nicaragua came and imposed this like culture, and not just like culture, but extreme oppressive conditions onto the region. So yeah, all of that just gets me thinking about that as well.
More questions we keep just trying to answer. So, one really arbitrary question is how we label the Caribbean, especially in terms of thinking of Latin America and, the Spanish speaking and obviously language borders. So what's your kind of take on the Caribbean versus Latin America, and what countries are part of the Caribbean and Latin America, etc.? It's a big toss up.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think in large part, it's really up to the person that's defining the region. I think also a lot of that is dependent on one's kind of like political position, or the way one kind of like thinks about the kind of social, historical, and political construction of the Caribbean. I think for one, a lot of that has to do with anti-Blackness, which is something we've seen in the way that like Haiti gets taken up or is excluded from the kind of like Latin American grouping. But yeah, I think in general, you know, there's like the camp of people who are like Latin America and the Caribbean, and then you also have people who are like the Caribbean is Latin America and Latin America is the Caribbean. So it's really up to the person, I think.
It also, for me, brings up the question and the impact of sugar, right? So, you know, for a lot of places that were former colonies and, you know, maybe even today are staples of certain economies and cultures, the impact of sugar on what we call the Caribbean. So, a Trinidadian scholar, Lloyd Best, in his 1967 report called the Independent Thought in Caribbean Freedom, he talks about what he labels the Caribbean as plantation America. And so, you know, for the Caribbean, sugar was one of our major exports, which, you know, then spills into rum, etc., as part of the transatlantic slave trade. But he cites sugar cane production as central to the definition of the Caribbean and its economic, social, and cultural, and even political development. So this, you know, for me brings to mind Suriname, which is one of those other places that are, you know, sometimes questionably Caribbean. But Suriname was one of the major producers of sugar in the 18th century and rivaling, you know, some of the largest Caribbean, other Caribbean sugar colonies, including Jamaica. So this is just like another way that we can conceivably tie colonial history, but just, you know, our history broadly together to expand our definitions of the Caribbean. So, you know, these were a lot of questions. We probably have more questions than answers going forward,
Mm-hmm.
which is okay because, you know, we're still figuring things out. But I guess I think something that I wanted you to, you know, definitely have space to do was talk more about how this is playing out in your own research on Nicaragua. So you've talked a little bit about the history and even, you know, greater, more so in the Western, what I think we're thinking of as the Western Caribbean. So, you know, that coast of Central America. So talk a bit to us about your research and these questions and what you're kind of conceiving going forward, because, you know, I'm excited for the dis, or as we would say, dissertation. Sorry.
For the
I'm
disc,
excited for the
that works.
dissertation to drop. Yeah, I'm waiting for it. I'm waiting for it. So let us know.
Thank you. Yeah, I kind of did talk a little bit about like the history of my project, but my dissertation is historical. It does have like a large historical portion in which I kind of, I don't want to say try to put the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua on the map because there's a lot of traps to like recognition, which is something we
Yeah.
can talk about if we have time. But, you know, I guess something that has plagued me through a lot of my like scholarly life is the fact that like we're a place that you know has just this really complex history and was like so central to colonialism in the Caribbean and just like
Mhm.
Western colonialism in general and the making of the modern Western world, yet like our history is like little known. It's not until like I would say
Yeah.
like the last like 20 years, maybe like 15 years, that like Caribbean Central America has been really like spoken about both in like scholarly discussions, or mainly in scholarly discussions. I don't even know about like in general like public perceptions of the Caribbean. But yeah, so my dissertation kind of, you know, traces the colonial history of Caribbean Nicaragua. The history of Caribbean Nicaragua, you know, it was a British protectorate, but essentially a British colony. And I trace the way that like not only the British but like multiple colonial actors, such as like Nicaragua, once Nicaragua gained independence and became a state, also such as like the Moravian Church, how like all these kind of like transnational colonial bodies were present in the region, and how what was central to this colonial enterprise was gender and sexuality and race.
Mm.
So I'm thinking a lot about the ways that like Black women were seen and represented by these colonial actors, and the ways that Black women were harmed by these colonial actors. And so, you know, we can talk about the difficulty of, you know, as hot as Sadia Hartman has written about, the difficulty of the archive and kind of like tracing violence through the violence of the archive, and how that's a sort of conundrum in and of itself. But what I'm trying to do is kind of trace a visual history of colonialism and like racialized, sexualized colonial violence on the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua. Because I think, there's been quite a bit of scholarship that talks about Black women's activism and like race and gender in Nicaragua, and that focuses on the Caribbean coast, but I haven't seen a kind of like historical genealogy be laid out. So I think my work is trying to make an intervention in that area in order to think about, the contemporary moment and the ways that contemporary Black women artists from the coast, visual artists, I don't want to say speak back, but are sort of working within and against that kind of visual colonial legacy and the violences of that legacy. So, my project is essentially about Black women's art. I'm very intrigued by Black women's visual art, particularly painting and kind of like textile art. But yeah, so my project is like, it has a historical portion and then a contemporary portion that's focused on Black women's art. But I think in general, beyond the specifics of like me looking at art, I hope that my dissertation can, make an intervention in kind of like situating the Caribbean coast as unquestionably a part of, the Caribbean. And, hopefully in the future, I would like to expand that work to branch out more generally, to be about like the Caribbean coast of Central America and not just Nicaragua. But for right now, my focus is Nicaragua.
Oh, yeah. As we say as PhD students, a done dissertation is a good dissertation.
Exactly.
So, all the rest of it can be book 2 and book 3 and book 4. But I think what you're doing is really important because it's, so segmented how we talk about the Caribbean, which is, definitely the reason why I wanted to have you for this episode, for us to really start conceiving what it means to think about the Caribbean as a broader region and then as a broader people, so don't necessarily think that you meet somebody from South America or from Central America and that maybe in some senses, we're all going to have our differences, but there are also a lot of commonalities that we could draw amongst each other. But yeah, all to say that thank you so much for, being our inaugural guest on Strictly Facts. I'm so happy that you were able to join us for this episode.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. This was a real treat. I really enjoyed speaking about Caribbean geography. I don't get to do it enough.
Oh, I know, girl. That's what Strictly Facts is here for. Wayago, stay tuned for Strictly Facts Sounds, where we connect our history to popular culture. Strictly Facts Sounds is a segment of the podcast that connects Caribbean history to popular culture. Music is such an integral part of our culture, whether it's through cultural performances like Carnival or Junkanoo. A sound clash is an equally important part of our music culture, in which rival sound systems clash or compete to see who has the better dub plates. In this segment, Strictly Facts Sounds embodies this history to become our very own historical sound system. While there are no exclusive dubs yet, we'll share various songs, performances, and more that showcase different parts of our history that relate to each episode's theme. This week, we challenge the geographic boundaries of the Caribbean while speaking with Melanie. Some songs that add context to this episode are I'm Black History, I'm Black Culture, and Rock Down Central America by the Soul Vibrations. These two songs by the Nicaraguan group The Soul Vibrations historicize the connections between what we think of as the Caribbean and Central America. Also, the Corn Island song by Arlene Hodgson details the complicated history and culture of Corn Island, where Melanie's maternal family is from. As always, you can find our list of Strictly Facts sounds online on our Strictly Facts syllabus. Guys, the conversation never ends. We are going to be continuing to think through what we talk about as the Caribbean and all that, all the histories, all the political histories. It's expansive. So, we'll keep going. If you have any ideas or questions or, thoughts for a next episode, Make sure you follow us on all social media platforms. We are Strictly Facts Pod on Instagram and Facebook, and Strictly Facts PD on Twitter. Before we go, make sure that you like, comment, subscribe, and even leave us a review. But yes, stay tuned for the next week's episode where we'll be talking about the Caribbean diaspora. Thanks for tuning in to Strictly Facts. Visit strictlyfactspodcast.com for more information from each episode. Follow us on Strictly Facts Pod on Instagram and Facebook, and Strictly Facts PD on Twitter.